Russia misses a British deadline for answers on the poisoning of a former spy. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. This is Al Jazeera Live from Doha. Also coming up, world-renowned scientist Stephen Hawking, who helped unlock the mysteries of the universe, dies at the age of 76.
We disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess he thought it was okay.
Trump fires his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and replaces him with CIA Director Mike Pompeo. Zimbabwe tells the world its economy is back on the right track, but foreign investors are not so sure. Russia has missed Britain's deadline for answers on the poisoning of former double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Prime Minister Theresa May wanted to know why a Soviet-era nerve agent was used. The Kremlin says it won't respond without samples of the substance. May is expected to discuss Britain's reply when she meets her National Security Council later on Wednesday. Barnaby Phillips reports.
Is this the lull before the storm? The British government says it's looking at ways of responding to what it believes is an outrageous act by Russia.
So this is part of a pattern of behavior by Vladimir Putin and his regime. And you're seeing this reckless support for the use of chemical weapons all the way from Syria to the streets of Wiltshire in our country. And I've been encouraged by the determination of our friends to stand with us.
Except that friends aren't so predictable these days. The American president, shortly after sacking a Secretary of State who was highly regarded by the British government, says it sounds to him as if Russia was involved in the nerve agent attack. But in Moscow, the Russian foreign minister said Britain was being obstructive, refusing to give Russia samples of the nerve agent so that it could carry out its own investigation.
Russia is not guilty, but Russia is ready to cooperate in the framework of the Chemical Weapons Convention, only if the United Kingdom takes pains to fulfill their legal obligations according to the same document.
London's luxury properties, luxury shops. Could Britain target Russians who spend money here? An anti-corruption group estimates more than $1 billion of suspicious Russian wealth is invested in UK property.
Well, it's certainly the case that some of the individuals that we've identified in this research are well known to the Kremlin. So if they were to find themselves subjected to police investigations by unexplained wealth orders, for example, then that would send a very clear message to the Kremlin that corrupt individuals and their illicit cash are no longer welcome here.
British politicians want to send a message to Russia that they won't tolerate what they see as a brazen attack on British soil. But they also hope to cooperate with Russia on issues like containing Iran and North Korea's nuclear ambitions. In other words, Russia's international significance presents Britain with a diplomatic dilemma. Britain says it's ready to act, but if this crisis escalates, Western unity could come under great strain. Barnaby Phillips, Al Jazeera, London.
British counter-terrorism police are investigating the death of a high-profile Russian businessman. Nikolai Glushkov was found dead in his London home late on Monday. The 68-year-old was an ally of the late oligarch Boris Berezovsky, a critic of President Vladimir Putin. Police say there's no evidence to suggest a link to the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Let's bring in Lawrence Lee. He's in London with more on the story. What are you hearing about the responses out there, Lawrence?
Well, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, is going to hold a meeting in an hour or two's time with the National Security Council, and they're going to go through what they think are all the options available to them, since the Russians have now completely ignored their demand that they respond by midnight last night. And the trouble is, for the British government, that none of the options that they actually got at their disposal are particularly threatening to the Russian mindset. As I was saying before, there is this narrative from Moscow that for some time now, for some years, has basically said, how dare this little tiny country, Britain, challenge us or threaten us, the mighty Russia, you know, you can fit Britain about 150 times into Russia. In terms of land mass, it's the biggest difference in the world. And obviously Russia's got an enormous nuclear arsenal. And the British armed forces are tiny and shrinking all the time. So in that sense, Russia feels very unthreatened by the UK. And if you look at the things that the UK government are thinking about, apparently, things to do with expelling a few diplomats, well, they can do a tit for tat and expel some British diplomats from Moscow. If they want to shut down the Russia Today TV channel, Moscow has already said, well, in that case, we might kick out the British TV from Moscow. If they want to hoof out some rich Russian expats, Moscow won't care about that at all. I think honestly, the only thing that the UK could conceivably do to hurt Russia in response to this is to turn to the European Union and say, look, as a bloc and a continent, we need to stop importing Russian gas because it's the mainstay of the Russian economy, and that would genuinely hurt Russia. But obviously Moscow knows that at this point in time, the UK is in the middle of leaving the European Union. And so the chance of the UK getting European support for anything major and long-term as a strategic goal like that is almost nil. And so in that sense, it all serves Moscow particularly well because it can then portray the UK as trying to be threatening but actually failing.
And might it serve Putin well in the upcoming elections?
Yes, I mean, and I think it is a theory now that's been doing the rounds really more or less since this started. How can it be that this poisoning happened with a direct link back to Moscow about a fortnight before the Russian election? Surely these things might be linked, says the theory, if you assume that the Russians had something to do with this. And the argument is that even though Putin is obviously a shoo-in for a fourth term as president, the problem for the Kremlin is apathy and people not turning out to vote. That's what they're worried about. And so to try to, it is theorised, re-energise the population around a Kremlin strategy that says Putin is our saviour, we're under attack from all these Western powers who are trying to despise us and decry every single thing about us. Look, here's the British even saying that we poisoned one of these guys even though we never heard of him and had nothing to do with him anymore. It all plays into this idea of Russia being under attack and Putin being the only man who can salvage Russian pride.
Thank you for that, Lawrence Lee. One of the world's greatest scientists, Stephen Hawking, has died. He was 76. In a statement, his children paid tribute to their father as an extraordinary man whose work and legacy will live on for many years. Emma Hayward looks back on his life and achievements.
His was a life of applause and accolades. Stephen Hawking was often treated like a rock star scientist. Millions revered him for his gift of communicating complex matters to the masses, the common man's genius.
We are alive. We are intelligent.
Hawking decoded some of the most enigmatic mysteries of the universe, its origins, structure and end, from Big Bang to black hole. His life was also an enigma. 1963, Hawking was almost 21 and a student at Cambridge University when he was diagnosed with ALS, a degenerative motor neuron condition. He was given just 2.5 years, but went on to live for more than half a century.
It taught me not to pity myself, because others were worse off, and to get on with what I still could do. I am happier now than before I developed the condition. I am lucky to be working in theoretical physics, one of the few areas in which disability is not a serious handicap.
As the disease progressed, Hawking lost mobility and had to rely on a wheelchair. His speech then began to slur, and an emergency throat operation robbed him of his voice, but not for long.
Space, here I come.
Hawking turned to a speech synthesizer, which allowed him to select words by moving the muscles of his cheek. It was a tedious process, but one that gave him the ability to express his pioneering ideas. It also gave the British cosmologist his trademark American accent.
There have been a few setbacks, like the Dark Ages.
Hawking was respected early on in scientific circles for helping prove the Big Bang theory when the universe burst into existence 14 billion years ago. Global acclaim came in 1988 with the release of his book A Brief History of Time. The introduction to cosmology was a runaway hit, selling more than 10 million copies and eventually translated into dozens of languages. Hawking's fame only magnified with time. A pop culture figure, he guest starred on shows such as The Simpsons and Star Trek.
You are bluffing. Wrong again, Albert.
The fluorescence in the washing powder is caught by the...
Public fascination with Hawking culminated in the blockbuster Hollywood film of his remarkable life, The Theory of Everything.
The universe is expanding. If you reverse time, then the universe is getting smaller.
Stephen Hawking devoted his life to seeking answers to the questions of our existence, and in doing so, he helped us to peer deeper into how our universe works.
Morris Jones is an analyst and author on space. He says Hawking was a brilliant communicator as well as one of the world's greatest physicists.
He was very lucid and very good in terms of composing phrases and ideas. Some of his concepts are almost poetic, and I think instead of just being very dry and very calculating, people could see the human side of him, as well as this brilliant scientist and mathematician. And so there was definitely that charisma and that mystique about him. He was a personality as well as a genius. There are a lot of people who probably wouldn't be scientists unless they had grown up alongside Stephen Hawking and come under his influence through his media appearances and his books. And one of his long-term legacies, I think, is the fact that towards the end of his life, he was focused on some questions beyond physics itself, like, does the human race have a future? And he was considering how we could survive or if we would survive. And I think those questions really caught public attention because it's something that we all worry about.
Outgoing U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is urging a smooth transition after President Donald Trump fired him on Twitter. One of his top aides released a statement saying Tillerson didn't know why he was forced out. That official was later fired as well. Democrats say it's another sign of chaos in the White House. Trump blamed policy differences. The two had disagreed over a number of issues, including the Iran nuclear deal and the blockade of Qatar. Tillerson will be replaced by CIA Director Mike Pompeo. He advocates a more aggressive stance on North Korea and Iran, and his job will go to Gina Haspel, who's set to become the first female leader of the CIA. Rosalind Jordan looks back at the friction between Tillerson and Trump.
It's not every day you lose your job via social media, but an emotional Rex Tillerson deliberately ignored that detail when he addressed reporters on Tuesday.
I received a call today from the President of the United States at a little after noontime from Air Force One. My commission as Secretary of State will terminate at midnight, March the 31st.
Tillerson served as U.S. Secretary of State for a little more than a year. He spent much of that time pushing back against reports that the president, Donald Trump, wanted to fire him. On Tuesday morning on Twitter, Trump did just that. Mike Pompeo will become our new Secretary of State. Thank you to Rex Tillerson for his service. Trump then told reporters this.
We disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess he thought it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently. So we were not really thinking the same.
Looking back, it's clear Trump and Tillerson disagreed on the big problems of the day, whether or not to engage directly with North Korea, how far to hold Russia accountable for its meddling in U.S. political and civic affairs, something Tillerson made a point of stressing the U.S. must do. Ultimately, former U.S. diplomats say Tillerson's firing is no surprise, and neither is the choice of his replacement, the CIA Director Mike Pompeo. He's well known for his support of Trump's policies.
Trump is impulsive. Trump is temperamental. Trump wants enablers and validators more than he wants advisors.
Tillerson didn't have many fans at State because of his plans to cut staffing by nearly 30%. Some senior diplomats quit in protest. But the firings at State didn't end there. At lunchtime, the White House dismissed Undersecretary of State Steve Goldstein after he released this statement suggesting Tillerson thought his job was safe. The secretary did not speak to the president this morning and is unaware of the reason for his dismissal. In any case, Tillerson said he had no regrets. Rex Tillerson didn't lose his job because he didn't agree with the president. Analysts say he lost his job because he refused to pretend that he agreed. If confirmed, Mike Pompeo will face a very high standard of agreeing with the president all the time, especially because the president believes he already does. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, the State Department.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera, the Philippines president turns his back on the International Criminal Court Plus.
I'm Nick Clark reporting on the increase in krill fishing in Antarctic waters and the bid to try and restrict it.
Hello again. Across southeastern parts of Asia, we've got some pretty heavy showers affecting southern portion of Borneo, and Java and Bali seen some heavy rain in the last 24 hours or so. Indeed, further towards the east, it's looking pretty wet. We've got showers moving in towards the Philippines. I think through much of Thursday, weather conditions should be dry and fine, but through Friday, that's when the showers are likely to arrive. I think for Java, showers are probably decreasing a little bit through Friday, and then moving up through the Malay Peninsula, we've got a scattering of showers, but generally I think weather conditions for both Singapore and Kuala Lumpur are looking reasonable, but still a chance of 1 or 2 showers around the Gulf of Thailand, though the forecast indicates largely dry weather for Bangkok. Now, as we head down into Australia, this was a tropical cyclone Linda, but has been downgraded. Nevertheless, it's going to have an impact across the region. And we've still got some pretty heavy showers across the top end. Darwin could see 1 or 2 downpours. Otherwise, that flow is going to be quite warm for Townsville at 30. But the southwesterly wind is going to keep temperatures at just 19 in Melbourne, but a warm one for Sydney, 29 degrees. Cooler conditions likely in Perth. As I move the forecast through, Sydney's temperature dropping down a little bit to 25 degrees the high. And across in New Zealand, looks like there'll be some showers pushing up from the southwest, highs of 22 in Wellington.
Sub-zero temperatures, extreme altitudes, deadly roads.
This is where the hard part begins.
The extraordinary journey from Osh to Tajikistan, braved by ordinary drivers.
We're too high up. There's no oxygen.
Just to experience life's simple pleasures. Risking it all, Kyrgyzstan. At this time on Al Jazeera.
Again, top stories on Al Jazeera. Russia has missed Britain's deadline for answers on the poisoning of former double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter. The UK wanted to know why a Soviet-era nerve agent was used. The Kremlin says it won't respond without samples of the substance. World-renowned physicist Stephen Hawking has died. He was 76. His children paid tribute to their father as an extraordinary man. His work and legacy will live on for many years. The U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who was fired on Twitter by President Donald Trump, is urging a smooth transition for his replacement. Tillerson's also warning of what he calls Russia's troubling behavior and actions. In the U.S. state of Pennsylvania, the Democratic candidate is claiming victory in a special election, despite his Republican rival not yet conceding defeat. Conor Lamb leads Rick Saccone by around 600 votes, with several hundred absentee and provisional ballots still to be counted. John Hendren has more from Washington, D.C.
It was a race that shouldn't have been close at all. And that makes Conor Lamb the new hope of the Democratic Party.
It took a little longer than we thought, but we did it. You did it. You did it.
In a nail-biter, the young, charismatic former Marine and Republican state legislator Rick Saccone finished in a near-dead heat in a special election for a U.S. congressional seat in Pennsylvania that traditionally leans Republican.
And we're going to keep fighting, and don't give up, and we'll keep it up. We're going to win it!
That has Democrats believing they can retake Congress with an anti-Trump bump. Donald Trump won the district by about 20 percentage points in 2016. Analysts say this election could be a sign of things to come.
This really will be seen as a referendum on Donald Trump. Democrats are going to take that as an indication, an early indication, that the November results could be very good for them, and they're going to believe that they have a real chance of taking a majority in the House of Representatives.
Late in the campaign, Saccone reached out to his party's president for help.
Are we in Trump country? Is this Trump country?
The president, hoping to keep Congress Republican, reached back.
Go out and vote on Tuesday for Rick Saccone.
The president even dispatched his son, Donald Trump Jr., hoping to push Saccone ahead.
He's going to support the things that my father's doing. You get a real conservative who's going to fight for America and help us push through this agenda.
But here in steel and coal country, Lamb appealed to many of the union workers and blue-collar Democrats who supported Trump 2 years ago. Many are now disillusioned. Despite the protective steel tariffs, Trump hoped would keep them voting Republican.
It's heartbreaking because I voted for Trump. We all had hopes that he would change everything, but I guess we were wrong, or maybe we're wrong right now. I don't know.
Democrats hope to make more gains like they have in Pennsylvania, but that will depend on whether they can run electorally appealing candidates like Lamb and whether they continue to face an unpopular president. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel has been re-elected for a fourth term. Parliament voted by 364 to 315 in favour. The new government will be sworn in nearly 6 months after national elections. Earlier this week, Merkel's Christian Democrats Party, a Bavarian party at the centre-left, Social Democrats signed the official agreement to form a grand coalition. The Philippines is withdrawing from the treaty that founded the International Criminal Court. President Rodrigo Duterte says it follows what he calls baseless, unprecedented and outrageous attacks from UN officials. The ICC was investigating his campaign against illegal drugs, which has left thousands of people dead. Duterte is accusing the court of violating due process by trying to have jurisdiction over him. Shamela Alin-Dogan has more from Manila.
In a rare written order coming from the president himself, he says that the country is withdrawing its ratification of the Rome Statute immediately. But that's not how it works, because based on the rules of the ICC, which covers member states like the Philippines, it will take a year after the UN Secretary General receives the letter before this basically withdrawal becomes effective. It also cannot and will not have any impact on countries with pending investigations, such as the Philippines and President Rodrigo Duterte's government, currently going through a preliminary investigation by the ICC for crimes against humanity. Since President Rodrigo Duterte was sworn in 2016, rights groups say at least 10,000 Filipinos have already been killed because of his so-called war on drugs. That's something that his government and the police forces deny. They say basically that many of these Filipinos have been killed by vigilante groups, that this is a drug war, and that basically a lot of them, and the question is the number itself, whether the 10,000 is really accurate or not. But what is going to be sure here is that in the next coming months, not much will change. The Philippines will still be part of the ICC, and the investigation when it comes to the probability of a case to be filed against President Rodrigo Duterte and members of his cabinet will continue.
Human Rights Watch is urging Saudi Arabia to immediately investigate reports of coercion and abuse during its campaign against corruption. The New York Times says 17 detainees, including members of the royal family, needed hospital treatment after interrogation, and the body of a National Guard general showed signs of torture after he died in detention. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is due to visit the US next week. The UN says more than 300 civilians have managed to leave rebel-held eastern Ghouta in Syria despite ongoing airstrikes. The Syrian civil defense says Russian planes dropped cluster bombs on residential areas in the city of Kafr Batna. Air raids and shelling by government-allied forces also targeted neighboring towns. At least 13 civilians were killed and dozens were wounded. And following airstrikes in Idlib, rescuers worked to free a woman from a collapsed building. For 12 hours, at least 5 civilians were killed and another 5 are missing from the same attack. Police in Paris have used tear gas to clear Kurds protesting outside the U.S. embassy. They want the U.S. to stop Turkey's targeting of Kurdish-held areas in northern Syria, including Afrin. Several demonstrators were injured in the scuffles with police. The U.S. backs some Kurdish groups fighting ISIL in Syria. Zimbabwe's business community is calling for all international sanctions to be removed to help improve the struggling economy. President Emmerson Mnangagwa wants to attract more foreign investors, but some are cautious about doing business with Zimbabwe. Hannah Mutaso has more from Bulawayo.
Tafadzwa Musarara's milling company produces 1,800 tons of flour a month. He thinks he could double production if sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by the West nearly 2 decades ago are removed. They targeted specific individuals loyal to former President Robert Mugabe. Musarara's company is not on the sanctions list, but he feels being Zimbabwean means many others like him are considered guilty by association.
We could not trade with countries or states in Europe sending money to Zimbabwe. Ultimately, it just go via New York. And there was a certain instruction that funds coming direct to Zimbabwean banks yet to be frozen or confiscated or returned back. That affected us. So we could not buy from Europe. A number of companies are victims to that.
Equipment bought from Europe and the US can't easily be replaced. The state-owned railway company is one of several that needs urgent foreign direct investment. Right now, President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government is leasing locomotives and wagons from neighbouring South Africa. He says it's a temporary solution until people are ready to do business with Zimbabwe again. President Mnangagwa says he'll respect human rights and hold free and fair elections. But the international community wants proof he means it. Then perhaps some or all remaining sanctions will be removed. To lure foreign investment, Mnangagwa's government says it will amend black economic empowerment laws to limit majority ownership for the state to only diamonds and platinum.
So right now, all they have to work with is promises, but not many of those promises are actually being actively kept. They keep on repeating them and encourage people to believe that everything they say is going to transpire, but that's not quite enough for the investors.
And until those investors see Zimbabwe as low risk, which could take a while, remnants of the once thriving industrial sector tower over the jobless. Hannah Mutaso, Al Jazeera, Bulawayo.
Conservationists are warning that the industrial fishing of krill in Antarctica is threatening the future of its ecosystem. Nick Clark has the story.
The Arctic sunrise sails down the west coast of the Antarctic Peninsula in the hope of observing krill fishing boats in action.
The main focus of the krill fishery across the entire area is in this peninsula region.
The expedition helicopter takes off, and a rare view of krill boats with their nets out, spotted fishing close to shore. They are operating within their rights, feeding the growing demand for krill-based health products like omega-3 fish oil, and they want to expand their fishery.
The krill are obviously densely packed into this area up against the island because the boats are just circling round and round, just hoovering them up. And in amongst it all the whales are feeding. You can see them blowing and whale tails disappearing, there's flippers showing, birds wheeling about.
The krill companies say they're tapping into a resource that is sustainable. But the view here on board is that is what they said about other species like the bison in North America or cod stocks off Newfoundland before both were decimated.
The areas closest to the shore are almost always where the penguin foraging grounds are, where whale feeding grounds are, where seal foraging grounds are, and it's exactly where these boats are choosing to come in and put their nets and take the krill. They're directly competing with these animals for food.
By radio, the campaign team suggests their company bosses should consider fishing in less ecologically sensitive areas, and with that, the Arctic sunrise moves on. For the team, this is just the beginning of the battle against krill fishing. Time to batten down the hatches. The ship is returning to port in Chile. There's still a major obstacle in the way, the Drake Passage between the Antarctic continent and Cape Horn, and the weather quickly deteriorates. They call the Arctic sunrise the washing machine. You can see why.
I think with the wind, it'll be probably around 3 in the morning. It said it'll increase. So if it gets too bad, what we'll do is put the nose of the ship into it and slow down and then just ride the swell.
Next morning, as predicted, it's blowing hard.
So this is the infamous Drake Passage, 6-meter waves right now, 70-kilometre-an-hour winds, but they tell me that this is quite mild compared to what it normally is. The Atlantic's over there, the Pacific is over there, and this is where both oceans converge south of Cape Horn, and the weather just keeps rolling in.
But after 5 days of stormy seas, we finally pass into the Magellan Strait. Our expedition over, the Antarctic continent behind us, and South America dead ahead. Nick Clark, Al Jazeera, Chile.
The top stories on Al Jazeera. Russia has rejected UK claims it was involved in the poisoning of a former spy and his daughter. It says it doesn't accept baseless allegations. The UK has demanded to know why a Soviet-era nerve agent was used to poison Sergei Skripal and his daughter, Yulia. The two collapsed in a shopping centre in Salisbury just over a week ago. They were taken to hospital and have been in critical condition ever since. The outgoing US Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who was fired on Twitter by President Donald Trump, is warning of what he calls Russia's troubling behavior and actions, and he's urging a smooth transition for his replacement, the head of the CIA, Mike Pompeo. The Philippines is withdrawing from the treaty that founded the International Criminal Court. President Rodrigo Duterte says it follows what he calls baseless, unprecedented and outrageous attacks from UN officials. The ICC was investigating his campaign against illegal drugs, which has left thousands of people dead. But the withdrawal won't happen immediately, as Jamela Alindogan explains.
Based on the rules of the ICC, which covers member states like the Philippines, it will take a year after the UN Secretary General receives the letter before this basically withdrawal becomes effective. It also cannot and will not have any impact on countries with pending investigations, such as the Philippines and President Rodrigo Duterte's government, currently going through a preliminary investigation by the ICC for crimes against humanity.
World-renowned physicist Stephen Hawking has died. He was 76. His children pay tribute to their father as an extraordinary man. His work and legacy will live on for many years. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel has been re-elected for a fourth term. 364 members of parliament voted in favor of Merkel. 315 voted against. Earlier this week, Merkel's Christian Democrats Party, a Bavarian party, and the centre-left Social Democrats signed the official agreement to form a grand coalition. Those are the headlines. Risking it all is up next.